us today on our first overview and scrutiny committee of 2021, the year of the vaccine. So hopefully we'll all see each other in person very, very soon.
Yeah.
So can I welcome you all formally to the meeting. Present at the meeting are members of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, co-operative members and a representative of the Harrow Youth Parliament. Also present are the Chief Executive, the Chief Finance Officer, the Leader of the Council and the Cabinet Member for Finance. Just a reminder everyone of the general protocols of online meetings. You should have your camera on unless but muted if you're a member of the committee. You should put any phones you've got to silent. And just a reminder that if there are any technical issues, we will adjourn and we'll pause to see if we can sort that out. If we can't, we may have to adjourn for another day. Okay, in terms of today's meeting, it is, I'll go through the agenda. So item 1 is attendance by reserve members. Are there any reserve members? I've not been notified of any. No?
No,
Okay.
not enough.
Declarations of interest. This has been a declaration has been published online. Are there any further that needs to be added?
Yes,
I've got Sarah. I've got Sarah and then Jean. Sarah.
All right.
Hi. Yeah, so with regard to any discussion of school budgets, I've already declared a non-pecuniary interest in light of being a local authority governor at Whitmore and a high school teacher in Harrow. However, I'd also like to declare a pecuniary interest, and should teachers' pensions be discussed, I will leave the meeting.
Okay. I don't think it ever has been in my 10 years as councillor, so well, maybe today will be the first.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm reflecting the first part of Sarah's declaration, in as much as I'm chairman of school governors at Shaftesbury High School, but it's non-pecuniary and I will stay and vote as necessary. Thank you.
Stephen.
Thank you, Chairman. As we're declaring school governor interest, I'll declare that I'm also a school governor of Wheeled Rise School, Wheeled Rise Primary School, and it's a non-pecuniary interest.
Okay. Are there any more? No. Okay. I have just seen a message that unfortunately the leader can't make it because he's unwell. So we wish him all the speedy recovery. Right, go to item 3, which is a Q&A session. This is our usual Q&A session on the budget, which we have every year as part of the council's general consultation and the administration's general consultation on the budget. What's been given alongside today's papers is a number of background papers, the draft budget and Mtfs that went to December's cabinet, draft capital programme that went to December's cabinet, revenue and capital monitoring went to cabinet as well. Alongside that, obviously, there is a need to talk about COVID, the council response. When we added, I was just reflecting back that when we added the COVID response to this agenda, we were in tier 2. So that tells you how quickly we've moved from tier 2 to tier 3 to tier 4 to the national lockdown in the space of a month. So what we're going to do in terms of COVID is, as usual, Sean, Adam, Dawn will be able to give an opening statement in that, both about the budget and also give us an update on COVID. We'll then go into questions. We'll start with COVID questions and then move on. As agreed cross-party, there are broadly 7 areas for the budget that we'll be discussing. COVID impact on the budget, but we can also go slightly wider than budget. Use of reserves and current year budget performance. 2022-2023 budget gap, capital programme, debt regeneration, council tax, and then any other. The aim is that people ask questions when we're on the relevant topic, and I aim to have about 15 to 20 minutes on each topic, and we aim to finish by about 8:30. That is the plan. I know Sean has to leave slightly earlier, 8, we may be done by then. So given that, before I ask Sean and Dawn and Adam to give us an opening spiel, can I just remind people that when you ask questions, questions are pithy, to the point, and not a long preamble. The answers, as well as being high quality and illuminating, the answers can also be short as well. And on that note, I'll hand over. I'm not sure who am I handing over to first, but either Dawn, Sean, or Adam.
Chair, my suggestion is if I give a brief update on COVID, and I'll do my best to keep within my 5 minutes. In fact, I will try and exceed that, and then hand over to Dawn and Adam, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So I suppose just a few points of overview and context. People will know that the case numbers in London are very high, including in Harrow. Although there is a degree of up and down depending on testing levels, we are between 900 and 1,000 in Harrow and in London, which is obviously, as the chair mentioned, reflects the fact that we were in tier 2 and now we are in national lockdown, and London has been at the epicentre of that increase, particularly due to the new variant. I guess the slightly good news, and this was reflected in some of the national figures today, it does appear that there is some evidence that tier 4 and the national lockdown is beginning to have some impact. Myself and the leader were on a call last night across London, and I think the situation is that there is at least a slowdown in the rate of increase, if not a plateauing in the position, which is what you would expect from a national lockdown and associated factors. We should, however, anticipate, because of the time lag, that the position in terms of the demands and impact on the health service would probably last another 2 to 3 weeks before that hits a peak, because there is that delay. And as people will have seen, hospitals in London, Northwest London and in Harrow, in respect of Northwick Park, are under extreme pressure. It's no exaggeration to say that Northwick Park is effectively full of patients recovering or being treated for COVID, and that obviously the number of deaths that we have seen both nationally in London and Harrow has unfortunately and very sadly continued to increase, and that colleagues in adult social care are very, very focused and are in the eye of a storm in terms of supporting the NHS in respect of discharge and managing the impact of the number of people who have been hospitalised and are being discharged, either because of the need to free up space within hospitals or due to COVID. My sense is that the next 2 weeks are critical in terms of the NHS's ability to cope, but that we will probably just about be okay by the skin of our teeth, given the amount of work that's gone into support the situation. Obviously, because of lockdown, tier 4, etc., there's been a lot of work around enforcement. People have seen there's a huge amount of debate and focus around the role of police, the role of enforcement, the challenge about getting people to stick to the rules. And I know that that's something that is of particular concern to members. I think that in a difficult set of circumstances, the response from the council and the response from businesses in Harrow has broadly been very good. But it is a challenge, and that people, frankly, as I'm sure you know from speaking to your friends and relatives, are finding adherence to this lockdown much more difficult than they were the first time round, and that messaging and support for that continues to be a challenge, but it's something that's very important going forward. People will also be aware as well that there's a massive economic impact, both in terms of individuals and businesses as a result of COVID. Lots of work going on to continue to administer and provide grants to businesses. This is much more straightforward. I'm not suggesting it's easy and doesn't create a huge amount of work, and Dawn and Adam might want to comment on this, than it was in the first wave, simply because we now have the details of all the businesses. So actually a lot of this is about repaying people that have previously been paid, depending on what they qualify for. So that is a more straightforward exercise in terms of speed, but the number of changes in terms of tiers, the schemes, etc., has been incredibly difficult. And also there's been a massive challenge around schools. And again, I would say that this is again a mixed picture. It's really good that on one hand that the definition around vulnerable children has been expanded, because it means that there are more vulnerable children who can attend if they don't have access to IT. The response from schools, teachers, head teachers and support staff has been fantastic in terms of generating online learning, which is great. However, schools are much more open in this lockdown than they were in March, which creates itself a challenge in terms of the numbers of pupils and potentially there being a transmission vector. But there's been an awful lot of work locally with schools to support that particular process. So that sort of explains where we are in terms of response. And the second thing is, as I've previously mentioned, there's a huge and welcomed ask from government to local councils about the role that we need to play in terms of supporting a lot of messaging and efforts around COVID. So I guess there are probably two or three big areas that we are involved in. One is as you know, we have been asked to significantly roll out lateral flow testing in the borough, which has been going on extensively over the past 2 weeks. We are getting close to having everything up and running. We've got town centre sites, mobile sites, sites at the civic centre, etc. This is really, really important, particularly about supporting key workers in terms of their ability to get tested, and that's something which the government has actually only today or yesterday confirmed that they will provide funding to take until the end of March, which is good news, but probably also tells us how long lockdown is going to last as well, if that's how long we're going to be in a position to have to do lateral flow testing. Secondly, big focus around supporting enforcement, resources to employ COVID marshals, lots of focus around communications and engagement, and really trying to get the message across to local people about what we need to do to break the chain of infection. And the last thing, and I thought I would leave it here, well, probably the second last thing, Chair, is obviously massive focus around vaccination. We are already vaccinating quite extensively at 2 primary care network sites in Harrow, at the Hive and at Tide Farm. We anticipate that the site at Byron Hall will be up and running by the end of this week. Vaccinations are also taking place in most of the council's care homes, already have done or are planned this week. Sorry, when I say the councils, I mean the borough's care homes. And from next week, social care staff and then will also be joining NHS staff in being vaccinated as well. And that by the time we get to February, we should see the mass vaccination hub going live at Byron Hall. The mass vaccination site at Wembley is going live next week, and that will be available also to Harrow residents. I am very confident about the vaccine infrastructure in North West London, hugely positive relations with local government, with the NHS. The issue is that there is still a challenge, and there will be for some time, and I think it's important to be honest about this. The challenge is not the availability of centres or people to vaccinate. The current challenge is the availability of large numbers of vaccines, and that still continues to need to be rolled out over the next few weeks. But I think that will grow, and I think by the middle of February we should see, potentially tens of thousands of people being vaccinated across North West London every day. But that's going to be a slow burn or a slow-ish burn over the next few weeks. The final thing I want to say is, I suppose I just want to say something about our staff. People like myself and Dawn, we are, handsomely rewarded for what we do, and this comes with the territory. There are, however, 2,000 council staff who have been working in a pandemic situation now for the best part of a year, doing a fantastic job, and many of those are now being, as many of you will be, particularly those of you that are parents, faced with a situation where you're both working at home and also having to deal with probably a significant degree of homeschooling. So I think that the challenge in terms of the ability to deal with both the practical outcome of the pandemic and also dealing with the situation of being in lockdown is pretty challenging. So that is both challenging in terms of people's ability to deal with, frankly, their stress and mental health, which we want to try and support them in, but also the practical impact on capacity, because it is much more difficult. I saw Councillor Greek nodding. It is much more difficult to do your job if you're homeschooling at the same time, and that's what is a situation that's impacting on, a significant proportion of our staff. So I do think, Chair, my final comment would be just to pay tribute to our staff across the organisation who are working very, very hard in the current circumstances. Hopefully that covers at a high level everything that there is to know about coronavirus, and that should give people the opportunity to ask any questions as appropriate.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to Adam and Dawn, talk about the budget, then we'll take questions on the budget and COVID together. But just a reminder to the committee, this is predominantly a budget scrutiny session, not a COVID scrutiny session. Adam or Dawn.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll also be I'll be very brief on the budget because I think everyone's seen the papers. I think in terms of the context, when we set our budget back in February for this year, we showed that we had a significant budget gap cover for the 2 years that followed, of about just over 22 million pounds. So even if COVID hadn't happened, I'd still be sitting here today telling you that it's a huge challenge to balance the budget, and that alongside typical inflation pressures, we continue to see really strong growth and pressure around our social care teams, particularly adult social care, and that structurally means that council budgets are just very, very tight, and that there are always risks in them, and then we've seen some of those risks particularly come to life this year. But obviously that's not what happened. In fact, we had the pandemic, and in fact that's as has been reported, made a massive difference to our budget. It's led to a huge loss of income, but also lots of expenditures. And you see in the report, and obviously it's a very fast changing situation, but we continue to document the scale of those pressures and also the insufficiency of the government funding that's come through. And again, we've seen that in other councils, particularly Croydon, which may well come up tonight, that has pushed them over the edge. I'm pleased to say that I don't think we're anywhere near that situation, but obviously the huge scale of the impact of COVID and the uncertainties around it does make it very, very tricky at the moment. And so that's the sort of the context that we face. In terms of the spending review that came through back in November, it was obviously changed from being a 3-year spending review into just being a 1-year spending review. And with that, the budget was also cancelled. It was supposed to happen at that time. It's been pushed back to March. And I think that just underlines the scale of uncertainty that we're facing. And that uncertainty is really on sort of 2 dimensions. The one is in terms of what government support, if any, will be available going forward. Obviously, we had some announcements from the spending review, but also some really big gaps around the availability of future emergency funding. And that's a massive question for us as we set the draft budget in particular, obviously going into final budget. But the second is also the wider impact of COVID on things like our income from fees and charges, which is also huge budget lines and very volatile as well. So in that context of high uncertainty, the government also, as part of the spending review, announced that in order for councils to be able to meet social care costs, they were going to have to levy additional adult social care precept. And it's well documented now in the national press that the government has effectively levied an increase in council tax of 5% on pretty much all of England's council taxpayers. And obviously, the council tax is a very rigid tax. We don't have very limited ability to make adjustments around the edges, and it's ultimately a regressive tax as well. And it's not one that we want to use, but the government has effectively directed that we use that lever. With all that said, we have generated a balanced budget for the next year, and so we're pleased to be in that position. Now, how did we get there? Well, there's no frontline service cuts, so that's also really, really positive, and underlines also the scale of difficult decisions that Harry has made in the past 2 years. you will see that we have put some reserves into the next year's budget. Now, the reserves that we've allocated for next year's budget are only those reserves that were expressly built up to support our budgets. So in other words, we've got some reserves which we set aside for emergencies, the core general reserve, but we've got some other reserves which we've built up over the past few years when we've had some positive news, for example, at the end of the financial year. We scroll that money aside to help us with future budgets, and that's the money that we're setting aside to help us with next year's budget. Having said that, we are managing this year's spending incredibly. We are hoping for the flexibility to reduce the amount of reserves that we use next year. So that continues to be our ambition, to set the budget, no frontline service cuts, and also without use of reserves. But at the moment, that's what you can see there. Just to end on a word about business grants and general hardship support. This has been an unfathomably hard year for both businesses, but also a large number of residents who faced huge challenges. I think the council has, stepped up a gear or 6 gears potentially around our ability to deliver that hardship support. We faced challenges in March and April around technology, but now we're in a position where, while some councils are struggling to get their grants out, we're paying most of our grants automatically without any application form whatsoever. And we're using our discretion to provide some additional support to those businesses that don't fall under those grant schemes. So I think that's a real tribute to the team. Obviously, it's still a hugely challenging time for businesses. We're very conscious about that. And equally on the hardship side, while we're implementing the government's hardship schemes, we're also continuing to look at what more we can do locally in order to support particularly those residents on council tax support to protect them from some of the increases in council tax and the other impacts of the pandemic. And with that, I think I'll stop, Chair.
Thank you. Dawn, was there anything you wanted to add? Adam was quite comprehensive.
Yeah, I don't think there is. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm going to open up for questions on impact on COVID on the budget, but also wider COVID questions. But just a reminder, we want to focus on budget matters predominantly. So I've got 4 people. I've got Sarah, Stephen, Jeff, and Jean. So I will go in that order and start with Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. It was just a question really about the cost to the council of dealing with COVID and how much of that has been refunded by the government at this stage.
Thanks, Sarah. So the unfortunately the estimate is constantly changing. It's a real challenge, and the information that we've published in the Q2 monitoring outlines an impact of £23 million, which accounts for £18 million of grant funding. Dawn might want to say a little bit more about the latest figures. I think we are going to publish updated figures as part of the Q3 monitoring. And I know that there's always a challenge with these meetings, that there's a bit of a lag when we get to ask, when the committee gets to ask questions about that. But I can tell you that there is still a significant gap between the total impact on income and costs and the amount of support that we received. So I don't know whether there's any updated figures we can share on COVID impact.
Yeah, we can. I mean, you've got a figure in the Q2 figure of 18.1 million, where we've received general emergency funding, and 4.3 million pounds of what we call compensation for income loss. They're roughly going to go up by about £2.5 million in terms of our general emergency fund allocation. So that takes us just to over about 21 million. And our income compensation will go up to roughly approximately 5.2 million. But as Adam has said, that funding is obviously, we are spending that funding on the services that we need to provide in the cost of COVID.
Great. Sorry, did you have any follow up to that? No.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Let's go to Stephen.
Thank you very much. I'd firstly just like to echo the thanks to the council staff for all their efforts in helping to tackle COVID, their ongoing efforts as well, and we're all very grateful for that. Just following on from Sarah's question, really. So you mentioned that we've had £23 million of extra COVID costs. I did note that the total number of total amount of direct grant that we've had from the government, not including all the business grants that have come in and then gone straight out the door, but the actual direct grants that the government has had, that we've had from government, is 27 million. So how are we still in a position where we're saying our costs haven't been covered?
One, I think.
Yeah, do you want me to cover that? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, great.
Yeah, I think what we do is we get our funding in terms of COVID can kind of be split into two camps. So we get the general emergency funding, and the compensation for fees and charges that we build into, which is used for our general expenditure. So that is the figures that Adam and I were quoting earlier on, which are shown in the budget monitoring report. But then what we also get is we get a number of grants. So for example, you mentioned the business grants, which is also, and all the details of that are shown in the quarter two monitoring report, which comes into the council but has to be spent on very specific items of expenditure. For example, like I said, business grants, infection control. So if you look at period 2, the amount of money that's coming into the council is very, very significant. I think from memory it equates to about 100 million, but obviously a lot of that has to come in and go out on very specific areas of expenditure. The money that Adam and I referred to earlier is the general emergency funding and the money for the loss of fees and charges, which kind of supports our general expenditure that we're funding, placements, money to the voluntary sector, loss of income from leisure services, etc.
Thank you. I mean, the 27 million that I mentioned, which is on page 99 of the papers. That specific figure is actually net of any. It doesn't include the business grant amounts that we've had in. That includes the amount. That's the amount that the councils directly had. It's 27.215 million. And that's what the council has directly had in terms of its own expenditure.
Which report is that coming from, Councillor?
It's the papers for this meeting, and it's page 99 of the papers for tonight's meeting. Right, I think it's probably the appendix C with the revenue and capital monitoring.
Can you tell me what paragraph that is, Councillor?
It's 2.48, and it's table 10.
Stephen, I'll have a go at answering that and see whether or not I get the right point where Dawn has a look at it. I think the difference is that I think that whilst there are some grants that go in and out, as in the council administering, as in we giving business grants, there is also a set of grants that the council gets, which is about the council spending money on new activity, which is not about is not available for the council to use to spend on loss of income or extra expenditure, if you see what I mean. So if I use an example, we have been given resources that we are currently spending, which is probably not in this report, to spend on additional COVID marshals. That's not either an additional expenditure on mainstream activity or a loss of income within the council's budget. It is the same type of in and out as you might get from a business grant, but it's an in and out that goes on additional activity, not based on the council's original budget. So I think that's the difference. So it is money for the council to be spent on new things, but it doesn't replace money that we've lost in the council's original budget for the year.
So if you look at that table, for example, you'll see there the reopening high street, safely fund, the enforcement compliance grants, infection control, all of those things would be associated with additional costs that weren't part of the council's core budget. It's really the emergency funding tranches 1 to 4, which is £18 million, which is the funding to support general, the general additional expenses that we've incurred, and the challenges that we face around loss of income and things like that. So many of those additional grants, as Sean says, there were actually additional activity that we had to put in place around them.
Dawn, did you want to add to that?
No, I think it's just I think all it is, Councillor, is just it's the first couple of lines in the table that the Councillor is referring to is actually the ones that referring to in the front table. Is that money that we can put just to our general over expenditure, not very specific to new expenditure.
So are you saying that the 23 million of extra costs that we haven't included in those costs, the amount of, so all the new stuff we're doing, we haven't included in those 23 million of costs?
Yes, that's the short answer.
I mean, because I was looking at that table, as part of that 27 million, these are other things that might come in and go out. They're relatively small items. I mean, the major items are these direct fundings that don't include those things.
Stephen, if I can give you an example, because it is, to use a technical term, it is bloody complicated. It makes my head hurt. If I use an example, so the number of packages of care that we may have had to put in place because there are people who have COVID, or the amount of money we've had to pay out to social care providers, is an additional cost which the government doesn't directly compensate us for, but we effectively use the emergency funding to cover that. The government has given us an infection control grant, which is an additional payment that we can give to care homes to help them pay for their PPE. In a similar way, in a similar way, we have lost, in a similar way, the government has said to us, which is very helpful. We are giving you some money to help you reopen. Earlier in the year, we're giving you some money to help you reopen the high street because of the impact of COVID. We've spent that money on reopening the high street. That hasn't helped with the fact that we might have lost income from X, Y, and Z on the high street.
Can I also add to Sean's point about it being what was the technical term again?
Yeah, exactly.
Very complicated. Yeah. That one of the challenges is, Councillor agreed that this is so fast changing, as I think has been sort of alluded to. I think we're now on our 10th business grant guidance or program, and the last one came out last week. So the problem with the very unfortunate problem, your questions are completely valid, but the problem with the papers is that the Q2 monitoring papers are sort of from up to September, and then the budget monitoring tries to kind of update it. Actually, frustratingly, the best summary that we've got is actually the Mtfs update in the October cabinet, which is not one of the papers that's on tonight's agenda, probably because we had a scrutiny meeting between now and then. But actually, in that paper, you want to go back to the October Mtfs update. There's actually a really nice table that sets it out as it was known back in October, obviously very out of date now, which shows that we had a £36 million impact prior to any government funding. We then received 15 million of emergency funding plus 4.7 income compensation, which meant that our net impact was a negative 16.7 million. Clearly, everything's moved on a lot since then, and we can try and kind of do that summary table again, but there's just an awful lot of moving parts to this.
So when you say 36 million now, is that including? Is that 36 million? Is that including all the extra things we funded? Is that like the total?
So that 36 million, I think when we did that summary table back in the October Mtfs update, that was the total of what we had, additional things we had funded up to that point.
Right.
I can't promise that there weren't some things that weren't included in that, but I think that was our best attempt at the time.
Stephen, I think sorry, I was going to say, Stephen, I think your questions and comments are really helpful. If I could turn it round, what would be the most helpful information that we could provide you with?
I think it would be useful. So, because what I want to make sure is that we're not sort of double counting things here, and we're not making claims that actually are not correct in terms of because if we're trying to track if the claim is that there's been that there's been a significant impact on the budget from COVID, which and that's added to our budget gap, then it's useful to be able to track that. So if we're getting estimates of overspend, which is 23 million, and then we're getting this list of grants that add up to 27 million, it would be useful to get an idea of how much of that 23 million has been compensated by the list of stuff in that 27 million. Yeah. So we can get an idea of actually how much of an impact it's having on our budget gap, because that's very important for us to know. So we need to understand that, and we also need to understand what's going on. What the underlying thing is what the underlying position is of the budget. As if COVID hadn't happened. If you see what I mean. Yeah. That's what we need. That's what we need to be able to assess.
I'm going to bring Dawn in because Dawn is. Dawn, I think Dawn's got an answer.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to look at it is if the 27, sort of adding to what Sean and Adam have said, is that is the amount of money that we've got in grant. But the big difference is that, for example, if we talk about the infection control money of 3.3, that is money that is coming to the authority, but the spend for that supporting expenditure is primarily sitting outside of the authority. So the money is giving it out to organisations to spend that money. So, and therefore, but the areas where that we have spent the money, and hence which is impacted on, which is therefore reflected in our monitoring and funded by, as Adam says, primarily the emergency funding, is therefore the first 2 or 3 lines, and that is therefore the funding that we can put against our budget because we have spent the money. So like Sean said, we've had to fund extra care packages, but some of the other money, like the money that's on the CEV might have been spent elsewhere. We have given it out. So the spend is where we have received grant in but paid that grant money out because somebody else has sort of, has therefore spent the money. But the money that we have spent therefore has an impact on our budget is covered within the emergency funding. Now, what we can do, Councillor, is when we do this appendix for the period 3, which quarter 3, which is just about to come out, we can highlight so it's very clear that which ones in this table are impacting on our budget. Therefore, you will see at the front of the report, if that would be helpful.
Yes, that would be helpful. I mean, what I would say is that obviously, that what you've mentioned is obviously the is going to be the primary source of making up the council shortfalls or contributing to making it up. But what we've also heard this evening is that there are sometimes various other bits of some of the other items that can be. Some of that money can be used to plug various gaps here and there, or are being spent on things that the council wouldn't necessarily, because it's coming out of this grant pot. It means that the council doesn't have to spend that money that it otherwise would do. So, in order to get a good picture, it'd be useful to sort of be able to pinpoint how much of these other pots are funding things that would otherwise be part of our core spend.
I think in terms of, and I'm gonna move us on to Jeff in a minute. I think what would be really useful is, if it's possible, an entirely, I'm sure this is going to be very difficult, but an analysis of an alternative universe where COVID didn't happen. What would Harrow Council have spent in 2021 if COVID didn't happen? What did it spend because COVID happened, and how much of that did the government give us to spend, and how much have we taken out of what we would have otherwise spent on libraries or other matters? That would fully clarify the position. I totally accept that's very difficult to produce, but I think that would help.
Sure, I think we can have a go at that, and I think it's definitely I can totally get that's the conceptual frame that we need to try and and sort of get everyone into. Just one last sort of point of clarification, because again, it's just sort of endless complexity here, but is the impact of COVID in the current financial year versus the total impact of COVID, or what we're forecasting it to be. Because, for example, the government has given us, the ability, which not necessarily going to use actually, but to spread any council tax that we don't collect this year, we can spread that impact over several years. And it doesn't, and so I think, you'd understandably think, for example, that if we didn't collect some council tax this year because of COVID, that would impact us this year. And actually, unfortunately, that's not how local authority budgets work. So we'll try and we'll do our best to kind of unpick this for the committee as part of the kind of upcoming reports that we publish in the next few weeks.
Great. We're always happy to have discussion about the collection fund.
Exactly.
Jeff.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the COVID crisis has now been going on for 10 months or more, and it's obviously likely to go on for some considerable time yet. So can I ask what contingency the council has if this crisis goes on longer than expected, whatever that is? And I'm not really sure these are the right words, but or goes on or gets worse and more serious than it is now. And with the new thing appearing, as far as I can read, to be causing a high rate of deaths amongst younger people, that's a factor which could sort of make it more serious.
Right.
Is it worth me giving a policy answer and then asking Adam and Dawn to give a money answer, or I'm happy to go?
Why not? Yeah, let's do a short policy answer and then a longer money answer.
So I think the short policy answer is, I think it's very difficult to say, because I think that the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that more resource and more response comes from government. So I think that this is one of these double-edged swords, which is that we all want this to end as soon as possible, but also the longer things happen and the more the impact, the more likely it is that the council receives additional support or help from government to respond to the specifics. So I think that whilst Adam and Dawn will talk about what resource the council's got to respond to a longer crisis, my political analysis is, if the crisis gets worse, it will be very difficult for the government not to provide the council with more money.
Okay.
I would echo that 100%, because I think there's a risk here when we, as we set our budget, we have to be very, very prudent, and we have to only look at what we know is coming down the line, what's been announced by government. And we are at risk when we set our budget of kind of taking the double negative, which is that we know that we've lost income this year, and that lost income could potentially carry on if the crisis continues. And we don't know that we're going to get any additional money from government. So the double negative is that we assume the crisis is going to go on and we'll lose income, and we assume we're not going to get anything from government. And it's extremely unlikely that both those things are true. Either we continue to lose income, but government sort of steps in to provide a bit more support, or the government doesn't provide support, but that's probably because we've had a bit of recovery. So I think that we are, we've been sort of relatively conservative about the small c, about how we, about the assumptions that we're making about what support we will get in future. I think the other thing to say is just that holding on as tight as we can to the reserves that we've got. So obviously the emergency reserves, which remain completely intact, and all the work that we're continuing to do this year to minimise our use of any additional reserves next year. And every penny that we don't use is obviously a penny that we can use if things were to get worse. I mean, I think, obviously one of the things that unfortunately we look at when we think about our finances is our relative position, because the sector is so dependent on central government. It's important to us that we're essentially not, that we're not at the weaker end of the sector. And I think that, all the work that we've done has put us in quite a good position compared to many councils, which means that we're unlikely, if things get worse, we're unlikely to be the sort of first the first to go on in the next wave of councils to face really, really serious issues. I think there is a sort of structural challenge here that if the government does decide that the answer to the fiscal challenges is more austerity, we end up in a position where our costs continue to rise, we don't get support from central government, and the economy remains weak. That is a very, very bad scenario. But to be honest, it's not a bad scenario for Harrow, it's a bad scenario for the country. So I think it's, that's the context we look at this through.
Great. Jeff, was there any follow-up to that?
I haven't got one, no thanks.
No. Okay, I'm Jean. Move on to Jean.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I won't be very long because mine are alerting really Sean to various things that I'm interested in. But the first thing I want to say, Sean, was for you to thank Mark Billington and Fern and etc. for the great work they've done this time round. And the reason I say that is because last time round we had many businesses contacting us to say how frustrated they were with the business grants, and this time there's been a very positive response, so please pass that back. Two things I was concerned about, maybe this isn't the right place, and sorry Chairman if it isn't, but you mentioned, Sean, key workers, and one of the things that one or two residents have said, not that many, is how do we know whether key workers are genuinely key workers? Because they are a cost to our budgets, our school budgets in particular, making places available to them and all the provision around that. Sarah might have an answer, I don't know. And the other one is more widely is around what is our HR forward plan? I gather we're looking at what's the word? Slimming down, reconfiguring some of the staff at the Civic Centre. What plan is that? How is it looking? Is there something I've missed around, what the aims and objectives are in terms of working now in a very, very difficult, unprecedented time, and therefore how can we be sure that we're not going to lose all the corporate knowledge, etc. if we lose people? That we generally have done a very, very good job for us. How are we managing that whole process? I say this, Chairman, because about 10 years ago when I was Chairman of Overview and Scrutiny, there was a very rampageous middle management review, and it caused a lot of pain and frustration to staff. So I would like to know whether this approach is one that is we're aware of, has been discussed and been agreed, etc. So, and that is based on the budgets, because at the end of the day, if we can't afford people, that's what's going to be happening. But it could be very short-sighted. So
absolutely, that's all questions for Sean.
Yes.
Thanks, Chair. I will answer those as best I can. I think in terms of the key worker, there is effectively probably 3 points that I'd make. I mean, the first thing is that there is clear government guidance to schools around what constitutes key workers, and as you all know, Jean, that there's been quite a lot of debate around, does it require 2 parents to be key workers? What's the situation around people without access to technology, etc., etc. So this is broadly a personal view, and I think that in terms of providing support to parents, I personally think the current guidance is a step forward, because it does recognise the fact that it doesn't require both parents to be key workers, and it also recognises the fact that if people don't have access to technology, that means that they are also potentially a vulnerable child. I think on the other side of the coin, I think that this has strained schools more increasingly over the period, not least of which because actually the requirements around online learning are a lot higher, quite rightly, but also the fact that schools are now busier, probably 50% busier than they were in the first lockdown, partly because the definition is wider, but also because parents are more willing to send their children to school if they qualify than they perhaps were in the first lockdown. Sure. And also there is a difficult challenge around schools have been closed for a purpose, which is because whilst children almost never get very ill from COVID, children are a transmitter of COVID to older people who can get ill as a result of COVID. So that's a difficult balance. And I think that schools have dealt with that challenge very well in a complex scenario. My sense is that whenever you have anything, people will play the system. But broadly, I think that the vast majority of people are being responsible, and the vast majority of schools are being reasonable. I've certainly had little evidence that that's different. Your second question, Jean, was, sorry. Oh yeah, in terms of middle management, I mean, as Councillor Swirsky said, we have, despite the financial situation, particularly because of COVID, made a decision not to make large-scale funding reductions across the council. So compared to many budgets that you will have scrutinised, there are not significant reductions in services or large-scale job losses that are contained within these budget proposals. Right. I would say the only exception to that, if it's an exception, is that clearly historically there have been budgets, particularly within the Communities Directorate, and Dawn may wish to comment on this, where unfortunately the council's projections of income have not matched what has ultimately been delivered. What that means is that there is a potential mismatch between the amount of resource that's in those directorates and the cost. That's a relatively small proportion of the council's budget and is not, an assessment across the piece. Within that, there may be some changes to the way services are delivered, and there are restructures that are currently out for consultation, which does look to consolidate some services within the Communities Directorate to match income budgets with expenditure budgets in order to be able to do that. Clearly, we can't rule out that won't result in a reduction in capacity or job losses, but I think in the grand scheme of things and in the history of the council's challenges around the budget, that's relatively small. Not to make it, but I think to provide you with some reassurance across the piece, we are not talking about large-scale budget reductions in directorates or significant impacts on staffing in the 21-22 budget. Clearly, there are some big challenging numbers in the future which may be more difficult to deliver without that sort of change. I don't know whether Dawn wants to add anything to that.
No, I don't think. I think as Sean explained, there are a few restructures undertaking, but the number of posts will either be consolidated or deleted is very, very few.
I just said one of the reasons I asked this is I was due to have a briefing with Paul Walker, and it was cancelled at the last minute, so I didn't have that information to hand. So I found that very useful. Thank you. I will obviously pick up on that. But if you could keep me posted around the HR, I know we have my colleague Mina who looks after HR, but I think something that's very important so that we don't lose sight of the human aspect, if you like, of our service. Thank you very much for that, Sean.
Thanks, Jean. Canty.
Hi, thank you, Chair. And I hope you can forgive me for just trying to revisit something we just talking about 5 minutes, but there's a reason why I say that.
Yes, I thought that would be the case.
Yes, well, I just might mention it, sorry. So, Chair, firstly, I just felt I'm making sure we are scrutinizing Harrow Council, not the government, because we heard more about the government, central government, than about the council, and it is important we don't lose sight of that. And the reason why I say this, that sort of, I think sometimes it'd be easier that if officers are not prepared, or councillors who are answering questions are not prepared, they should just simply say that, okay, we need to look further into it, because I'm more confused than I was when we started the meeting, and I'll tell you why. Because I think as much as yes, we need to highlight what the council's lost and what has been replaced, I am completely confounded and bamboozled and confused right now, because if Councillor Swirsky is going to mention 23 million and as Stephen rightly pointed out, is table 2.48 on page 99. Now, if you go further down, there's rates relief, there's the local restriction grant and so on. Now, those alone add up to just around 13 million. So when you add the 13 million to the other sort of 18 million, we got 31 million coming in, and Adam just explained we got a 23 million shortfall. So, you know, sort of, we got to compare apples and pears, you know, rather than with stones. So I think it is useful that we get some kind of consistency in the figures. And obviously, yes, we are going back and forth about quarter 2, quarter 3, the future was not for now. So I think it's just important for scrutiny to say, you know, this is a point in time, we're all on the same page, so we don't have these confusing arguments, because I know everyone's been working hard and, you know, we appreciate everyone's efforts, but when we sit here, I think things should be much simpler and we shouldn't really be kind of, you know, be feeling confounded. So that's just the point I wanted to make, Chair. Just another quick question, you know, the area, and if anyone wants to come back on that, please do, because it helps us understand as well and something to prepare better for next time, hopefully. But my main point was, Adam, again, around the question of consistency and understanding, or, you know, backing up what you say with the figures we have in terms of the papers. So we keep hearing from you that we don't have enough money, the budget's not enough, which I understand and appreciate and accept that that is a possibility. But then on the other hand, now, when we got an earmarked budget, which reserves, I think it's page 117, if everyone's got hold of that. So let me just explain what I understand when I say this. So not only have we got 32 different kind of reserves, but it says on top of the general reserve, we got 54.388 million in reserves. Now, how do you get reserves? When you get surplus. So surely, in terms of consistency, we can't on one end saying that we're all short of money and built up 54 million or 54.3 million reserve. That's a substantial part of our budget. So, you know, we got to be consistent in terms of how we understand and approach things, because things need to make sense and they need to stack up and they need to support what you say. So I do find it really puzzling that, you know, we couldn't be arguing about facts presented in front of us and what we're being told. So that consistency needs to be there for the scrutiny committee to actually be doing its job, to just to say, you know, we're scrutinizing like for like, and we can actually compare things. So that was my concern I wanted to relate to the committee, Chair. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to bring Dawn in on that point, and then I'm sure Sean might want to come in as well, and then Adam as well. But Dawn, do you want to come in on that?
You go, Dawn.
Okay. If I cover the reserves, I think, because what Councillor Babardi is referring to is one of our appendices in the budget monitoring report, covers the reserves, and what it does say is it says that there is a figure of total uncommitted reserves at quarter 2 of £45 million. But I think what it's really important to remember is a number of those reserves are money that we have to have set aside on the balance sheet, and in theory it is not our money. So if I pick some elements of that, so for example, we've got money on our balance sheet, so it's like money, you know, sat on our balance sheet that is to fund the PFI commitments that we've got. So it's money that we cannot bring into the council's budget. We've got some money on there that we've got against our insurance reserves, against our legal reserves. So it is money that we can't just bring into our general fund budget. It is set aside for a purpose. Now, what we have got, and we have been liaising with your fellow councillor, Councillor Babardi, Councillor Patel, that we have within that total figure, we do have some reserves that are available for the council to use. So we have our general fund reserves of £10 million, and we have some other reserves in there, for example, like budget planning, business risk reserve, that we can use. And as Adam has explained, that when we set our draft budget for December, we did have to call down on some of those reserves. And obviously, our plan is to try and put them back. But I think it's just about understanding that some of that money we do have to set aside for very, very specific purposes that we cannot just automatically bring into the revenue account. You know, and as I say, I've given some examples. We've got some DSG figures within that money, which is ring fence for schools. We have some Edward Harvest money, so that's a separate trust. This is part of that figure. As I said, we've got some HRA monies in there. So I think it's just important to understand that there is some of that, that that 54 million is not just money that we have sat there that we could just bring into the budget if we wanted to. It is there, and it is there for a very specific purpose.
Sorry, Dawn, it's not a follow-up question. I'm just saying you haven't answered the question I asked.
Okay.
I asked that you simply generate a reserve by having a surplus. You can just create a reserve out of nothing. That is my point I'm making. So I'm just saying you can only create a reserve.
Candy, I think the point's been made. So
can I come back just on a couple of those points, Chair?
Yeah,
sorry, Chair. So I don't keep asking this question. Can we get a clarification of that, please, Don? I did ask to say let's push to the results. Chair, I accept and I respect your authority here, but I'm just saying I was last on the list to speak, and it's a very fundamental and basic question. I don't want to be asking this question in the future.
Okay, if you let Adam and the officer speak, your question will be answered.
Thank you,
Adam. Thank you, Chair. So I think there's a couple of things. So Councillor Obadia asked again about the COVID impact. You know, there's two things to say about that. The one is that obviously the papers for this meeting were papers prepared as part of our regular budget process. We produce a lot of reports for the budget. We produce quarterly monitoring reports, produce a draft budget report, then the final budget report, and we actually produce additional reporting this year because of all the impact and the need to keep the public and councillors up to date. We produced the Mtfs update in October as well, and that's the last time that we try to bring together, because there's a huge amount of work to do what the Chair asked for, which I think is very sensible and good ask, but it is something that we can't just do on a rolling basis. So at a point in time, we produce analysis on things like what's the impact of COVID. We did that in October. Those numbers showed a big gap between what the costs and lost income were and what the grants that we'd received. We'll obviously have a go at that again and be able to share that with committee members and with the wider public in the multiple opportunities we have to do reports in the next few weeks as we produce Q3 monitoring and also the final budget report as well. So that's really on the COVID side. In terms of the reserves, I think Dawn's point absolutely stands, that these reserves, a vast proportion of them, have very specific purposes. And I understand your logic, which makes complete sense, that reserves come from surpluses. I'd say two things on that. The one is that some reserves come from specific grants that have been given to us for particular purposes. So, for example, the SIL fund, which is actually a very large quote-unquote reserve, that's money paid by developers into a quote-unquote reserve, but actually we can't use that to support social care. We have to spend that on infrastructure support development, for example. There's actually a reserve, which I think is actually the grant, which is specifically for grants that were for specific purposes but didn't get spent in a year. So some of these literally come to us, but only for specific purposes. And yes, you're absolutely right. There are some reserves which we have built up through surpluses. So the budget planning reserve, £2.6 million, business risk reserve, £7.5 million. Those were reserves we built up when, at the end of the year, last year, the previous year, we had some windfalls that we didn't expect. One, for example, was a bit of extra money in the London business rates pool, which was calculated only at the very end of the year. So we couldn't expect that money was going to come in. And instead of saying, well, let's just go spend it immediately, we said, let's put it into a reserve so that when we do face a very challenging budget, we've got that money set aside. And that's why I can come to you today and say we can set a balanced budget for next year without frontline service cuts and without digging into our emergency reserves. And I think that's the right approach.
Okay, I'm going to bring Sean in.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm going to get my senior officer tightrope out and sort of try and be helpful in terms of sort of giving a bit of context here. So, in most councils at the moment, and this would be true if the situation was the other way around, the administration, which happens to be Labour controlled, will be saying that the government hasn't made enough money available for councils and the whole world is going to come to an end because we haven't got any money. And similarly, the councillors supporting the government will say, actually, the council's being given lots of money and everything is fine. And the truth of the situation is probably, as always, somewhere in the middle of that. And I suppose as officers, what we're trying to do really is to try and, I suppose, explain what the position is for the council as a big business in the context of political disagreement and judgment about what the council's finances is. And I suppose all Dawn and I can do is to give you the best advice about what that situation is. And I suppose for me, I would pick out a number of things. There has been a big impact on the amount of additional costs that the council has got because of the coronavirus. We've spent a lot more money because of coronavirus because we've had to respond to it. Secondly, the council has got a lot less money because of coronavirus because of the impact on the economy and our income. Thirdly, it is absolutely true that the government has provided the council with a lot of money to compensate the council for the fact that it's lost money because of coronavirus, and also put in place an income replacement scheme because of the loss of income. At the end of the day, I think our view would be, at the moment, the total amount of resource in income replacement and grant doesn't quite match the amount of additional expenditure or loss of income that the council has received. But through our good judgment and our good stewardship, the council will probably broadly be okay this financial year. As we go forward, that situation is likely to continue, and the government has provided the council with some more emergency funding for next year. Will that or will that not, in the end, balance out the total council expenditure? Probably not, which is why we need to use and put aside some reserves for next year in order to be able to balance the books. Is that at the moment a complete disaster, which means the world will come to an end? No, it's not. But the amount of resource that we've got isn't the amount of resource that we need for next year. Does the council have some money if the world comes to an end in reserves? Yes, it does. Is that relatively modest to the council's overall expenditure? Yes, it is. Is it a lot less than most other councils? Yes, it is. I just think that in terms of getting a proper handle on where the council is, they are probably the things that I can say in my professional role, which is a sense of where we are.
Thank you. I'm
sorry, Chair. Sorry, I don't have a question, but just I'll be brief, 30 seconds. So, firstly, thank you for indulging me, and just to to comment on what Sean said. So, I think at any point in time, it's not my intention to be what the government's done or not done or how it's being perceived. All I am saying is that when we're having discussions in this committee, the papers presented in front of us, when we read them, should be giving us the same meaning or understanding that we're getting from briefing explanation from officers and councillors. And I think that's all, and it is important we maintain that, and we've all agreed that this is a committee that works together with each other and the government, and I think we should be giving that projection. So that's all I need to say, but thank you everyone for your comments, and I'm more than happy to, where I've not understood, I will speak to you directly if necessary. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Dan.
It was just further to one of the points Canty made about the reserves and earmarked and what I would call in my line of work restricted and unrestricted reserves and what uses they can be put to. This isn't the first time we've had this conversation, so I was going to suggest, would it be possible that when we receive papers around this next year, that we have separate tables, or each of the different reserves that are listed on page 117 have some kind of notes or color coded or explanation or subdivided that gives a better reflection on what wiggle room reserves the council has this financial year, next financial year, and the one after that. Because I recognise some of them, but there's quite a lot there, and I think it would be useful and kind of clear up some of this confusion that we seem to have every year.
Yes, that sounds like a good idea, and I can see Dawn saying yes, and she'll be the one doing the work. So
can I give one just caveat to that, because actually, Dan, I think it's a really, really good suggestion. The only challenge that we just have to be careful of is that we're not labelling some reserves as kind of, we can just spend those and there's no problem, whereas other reserves, we can't. I think absolutely kind of showing where there's, a bit more discretion, I think is something we can do. We just have to be careful to say, actually, these reserves are really precious and they go extremely quickly if we don't sort of take care of them. But I take the point completely, and we can.
Yeah, I understand there's probably more nuance than I just outlined, but I think it would be useful to give an overview. So Shri, we're going to move on to the next set of questions.
Yes, great. And the next set of questions happen to be on use of reserves, and we've done quite a bit of this. So I don't plan to talk too much about this, and hopefully we can move on as we gave the last section quite a bit of time. So predominantly this section wants to focus on the fact that the council is planning quite publicly, I think for the first time, to balance the budget using reserves. So if we can kick off by understanding why the council has made that decision, what reserves is it using, and what impact both from politicians and the officers you think that have to the budget stability of the council?
Can I give a brief intro on that, and then Don may want to say more, which is that I think I would possibly challenge that it's the first time we've said we'd use reserves in a budget. Don can correct me, but I'm pretty sure that actually some of these exact reserves we've just been talking about, business risk and so on, we actually have used in the past to as part of budget setting previously, and actually in some of those cases we're not, in the end, as the year's gone through, we've come to the end of the year, we've in the end not needed to use those reserves, but we have used them as part of certainly some draft budget setting in order to make sure that we are able to balance the books. So I think from my perspective, I'm comfortable that in an environment of very high uncertainty, we're putting aside reserves that, as I say, have been expressly built up to support our budget, to make sure that we can get to a balanced budget position without taking kind of drastic decisions right now on frontline service cuts. I think my objective is still absolutely to keep a tight rein on finances so that we end up in a position where we don't actually need to use those reserves, and that will help us ultimately, the following year. But again, I think probably, from a high level perspective, I come back to the point that Sean made, which is that to some extent in local government we're all in this boat together, and that if we find that adult social care costs continue to climb and the crisis gets worse and so on, we as a sector will need to look to government to help us out. The very last point I'd just make is that as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a real structural problem with local government. We are not the only council to push budget gaps back year on year by any stretch, and the number one driver of that structural problem is adult social care. We have been promised, I know Councillor Rowley doesn't want me to make points about the government, but the truth is we have been promised a plan for adult social care funding, and I do think it's important as a sector that we hold government to account to deliver on that plan, because that is the one biggest policy lever from a structural perspective that would help us to get back onto a better footing in future.
Yeah, Dawn.
I mean, Adam's explained that very well. I think one of the other challenges, just so people are aware, is when we set the draft budget for 21-22, we actually have to set that before we actually get our indicative settlement from government. So it's quite challenging, and it's probably been a lot more challenging this year, because you only have to listen. We're getting announcements every week. So when we set our draft budget, we have to set it before we get any indication of what budget we're going to get for the following year. So at that point of setting the budget, because we didn't have any certainty about what the indicative settlement was going to suggest, and then what the final settlement suggests, which we just got before Christmas, we did make the decision to put a further robustly manage the current year's finances, and to put a number of reserves into that budget, and therefore when we get past the final settlement, which will be reported in terms of final budget, that gives us more certainty on what our financial position is. It's still disappointing it's only 1 year and not 3, because we're back into that challenge. We're not quite sure what's going to happen the following year. And that's the decision why we plan to use reserves. Now, Adam has already said our aim is to use the minimum amount of those reserves that we've detailed in the draft report. That is very much our plan. We're working towards that. We have some benefits out of the final settlement that we were reporting, but also, but you know, our aim is to absolutely minimise those use of reserves by the time we bring the final budget to Cabinet in February.
Okay.
Chair, if I can also just mention as well, very briefly,
Yes.
I think this is also about practicality. The complexity of dealing with the pandemic is huge. The resource that council, departments, services, everybody's involved in is massive. And I think that it would have been almost impossible, never mind undesirable, to have during this period of time looked for ways in which the councils could have made savings. So, you know, from a technical perspective, and you know, I very much want to pay tribute to Dawn for being more relaxed about this than the Section 151 officer might instinctively be. We have decided to potentially put reserves to balance the budget for next year, rather than taking action to take cost out of the council, partly because we don't know whether or not we'll get more money, and also partly because it would be almost impossible for the organisation to do that at a point in responding to the pandemic. But there is some risk involved in that, and you know, it is quite a difficult decision for Dawn as the finance officer and Adam as the portfolio holder to take that judgment, rather than what would be the traditional response, which is if the income and expenditure don't add up, there's only one thing to do, which is you reduce cost. But actually that would be I think we've concluded that would be the wrong answer in the short term, given the fact we're dealing with a pandemic, partly because we might get money that we don't currently know about, and also partly because the organisation would really struggle to do that whilst dealing with the pandemic.
Okay. Is there anyone else that wants to come in on this section? Can't see any hand. Oh, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just wanted to ask, in terms of some of the lost income this year, I did note that there was a £2.4 million parking loss, and I just wanted to check how much of that is down to the parking bays being taken out of action, or on-street parking bays being taken out of action, particularly through things like the street space scheme.
I hazard a guess that the street space scheme has had incredibly minimal impact. I think overall it's the fact that, you know, as we know with the data that TfL provides on journeys, car usage is down well over, I think it was down 80% in March, April, and it's down something like 60-70% at the moment, and obviously that's replicated in November as well. And that means that, you know, obviously fewer people getting using the on-street car parks, the off-street car parks. Obviously there are fewer penalty notices as well. So, you know, altogether there's a significant reduction in car-related activity, I'd say.
We thought Stephen had enough fun yesterday at Tarsap till 10 o'clock talking about things like this, but obviously.
I mean, that's the impact of council finances didn't come up yesterday.
It's not fun, believe me, when you see businesses struggling because people can't park outside their premises, but there you go.
Okay, before we move on to the next section, I just wanted a quick question to Dawn. So the budget for next year assumes a 2 million underspend this year. The papers we've got for this meeting assume an overspend this year. So can you give us an update on whether the council is going to underspend this year, which is needed for next year's budget? Are you on mute, Dawn?
Sorry, I can confirm that when we report our Q3 numbers to February, we will confirm that that £2 million underspend in the current financial year is achievable, so we can be confident we can keep that figure in the budget.
Fantastic, great. As I see no other hands, I'm going to move on to the next area I want to talk about, which is going further forward a bit longer to 2022-2023 and future plans. We start off with a large gap in 22-23. Stephen, I'm going to bring you in first.
Thank you very much. So yeah, so as Satch has just mentioned, it was quite alarming to see on page 24 of the papers where it mentions that the budget shortfall for 2022-23, the estimated 25.7 million, exceeds the balance of the remaining non-earmarked reserves. Now, if that happens, are we effectively bankrupt?
Right, I'm gonna start with Dawn. It's a technical question, so we'll start with Dawn and then.
I think it's not a technical question, but no, Dawn would definitely have a good answer as well.
No, I think. I mean, no, it doesn't technically mean that we're bankrupt. What we are trying to indicate in this report is we're trying to be very open and transparent about the challenges that we've got with that budget. Now, what we do know is we've already talked about we will not be using some of the reserves, etc., to balance next year's budget, which makes the following year better. There will be some decisions around various bits and pieces that are not in 22-23 about some choices that we've got. But we've already said in the budget report that we acknowledge that budget gap is very significant. We acknowledge that actually we and Sean and I both talked about the funding, the future funding is very uncertain. So it's very difficult. You know, we know that probably some more funding will come in. We tend to get money every year, for example, for adult social care, but trying to predict that is very, very difficult. And you know, we know ourselves that we've had our fair funding review put back, etc. So we know that things will happen, but it's very, very difficult to earmark them. But we are also acknowledging that we know that there is an issue and that we are going to have to start that. We are starting that budget planning process, which I think we put in this report, saying we need to have some plans about how we're going to tackle that budget shortfall in by the summer period. So no, we're not saying we're going bankrupt, but I think what we are acknowledging is that we do have a challenge going forward, but we are now already starting to put those plans in place about how we're going to manage that challenge.
Thank you. But if we found ourselves in a position where the budget gap was higher than the reserves that we could use, what would we do? How would we bridge that gap?
But I think, and I'll just say a few, then I'll hand over to Sean. But I think, so for example, if what we would have to do is we would have to we've got choices and we've got tools around how to bridge that budget gap. So I don't wish to say this, but obviously one of the tools is around increasing council tax, because there are choices around how we can increase our council tax. There will be various decisions on funding, for example, around adult social care, etc., that come through during the year that will impact in our budget. But our challenge, to be fair and honest, is to make sure that gap does not exceed the reserves that we've got. It's not ideal to put reserves into the balance budget, but that is our challenge, that we have to get that down.
I think, Stephen, if I can just add to that. So, and I think this is always the difference, and I think it's a very good question, very fair question. But I think the point is that this is fairly typical of what councils have faced in differing degrees over the past 10, 15 years. As things stand at the moment, based upon our guaranteed income and our predicted expenditure, there's a gap. And it's right, because we don't have huge amounts of reserves, it could be, in theory, the possibility that those two things don't match. And if that happened, and we didn't do anything about it, we would be in the situation that you suggest. I think the point is that throughout the whole of that period, both politically and managerially, whoever is in control of the council, because that could play out if there's a change in political control after the 2022 elections, officers and members would have to sit down and say, what do we actually need to do to make that not the case? I think the point is that, and this is the bit that COVID has made very difficult, and the fact there isn't a 3-year settlement, and there is a judgment of Solomon in all of this, Stephen, is at what point do you make that decision? I mean, we could have said in October, on paper, the council's got a huge budget gap for next year. The only way in which we can settle that budget gap is actually to cut services, sack people, change a whole series of things to balance the books. We made a judgment that the likelihood was that there would be some more one-off funding. There would be a change in the income scenario. We would be given the ability to raise council tax, so that whilst we're not in a great position, we can balance the books. My guess is that myself, Dawn and Adam will be sat here this time next year, and you'll be asking similar questions about whether or not we've got that judgment right. But throughout the whole period of time, as every month goes on, we will be making those calibrations based upon the situation. I suppose the guarantee that Dawn and I can give you, and it's clearly for Adam to make his political judgment about it, is that if we ever thought that the situation that you proposed would ever really come to pass, we would effectively make the council make those decisions so that they couldn't come to pass. But we're always balancing whether or not we go too early or too late. But I think we can, as officers, say, if we ever thought there was a situation where the council's income and expenditure, even with the use of reserves, was not going to balance in a single year, we would be absolutely at the point at which we would be clear that we had to make the decisions, as unpleasant as they might be, to make the budget balance at that point.
So, I mean, that's where we seem to be heading if things stay out, if nothing changes. Obviously, you know, there's it goes on to say that, you know, various proposals must be developed and things like that to avoid this situation. But it's effectively saying we know we've got this train crash coming down the track, but we're not going to do anything about it till next year, when we might end up in an emergency situation. But what I'm really trying to understand is what are we going to do about it? And I know you're not necessarily in a position to answer that right now, but when are we going to have some idea of what we're going to do about this, so that we're not in a position where we've got to make very drastic decisions in a very short space of time? And obviously, I totally understand, you know, you are very hesitant to use the word that I described earlier, but, you know, to avoid that situation, what sort of decisions are we going to be making, and when, to avoid that outcome? Because obviously, if nothing happens, then we will end up in that outcome.
I'm going to help. So I'm going to help Sean out here. So I'm going to help Sean out, because I think that's quite a political question.
Okay.
And I think it's right that the politician answers it. So Adam.
Okay, fine.
And I'm going to have to go soon, Chair. I do apologise. Yes.
I just also echo Sean's point that I think your question is a very good one, Councillor. And I think obviously it's something we have to be, you know, very, very, very mindful of all the time. And the couple of things I'd say about it. And the one is that you will have noticed, you know, in these conversations kind of year on year, that we end up in quite a similar position each year, where, you know, we scrape the barrel to get to a balanced budget for the coming year, but then show significant budget gaps in the years that follow, and very, very, you know, very significant budget gaps. And I think there's, you know, a couple of reasons for this structurally. One is that we have a naturally very prudent way of budgeting, where we don't assume anything that we don't know, but we assume everything that we do know. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but in the sense that, you know, we don't know that we're going to get more, you know, adult social care funding, even though actually we've seen it come every year. We actually don't know what level we'll be able to increase council tax to until after the draft budget's set. And yet, you know, again, we have to, you know, that's been happening every single year for the last few years. So there's lots of things, lots of positive things that we don't know, whereas we do know that, you know, there'll be inflation and we'll have to spend money on roads and all those kinds of things. So that's one sort of structural issue, which means that we're always projecting, you know, slightly more bigger gap than probably is going to happen. The second issue is that there just is the structural issue in local government financing at the moment, where, you know, a increasing amount of our revenue has come through one-off grants from, you know, from government. And, you know, it's not a particularly political point, to be honest, because I think that even government will recognise that everyone wants to have a proper settlement over a period of time. And in fact, you know, let me give some credit. Let me give some credit to the government. I mean, years ago, I think it was 2016, the government gave us a 4-year funding settlement. Now, it was a horrible funding settlement because it showed that our grant going down from, you know, wasn't 50 million, but it was, you know, on the way 30, 25 million, something like that, to 1 million. We didn't like it at all, but actually we basically knew what our funding was going to be like for 4 years, and that's what happened. Whereas for at least the last, you know, couple of years, we really haven't got much sense. And so I think, you know, my anticipation is that there will be some additional funding available, from one source or another. And to your question, which is a very, very good one, about, well, when should we start making these decisions? I think this summer is the right point for a couple of reasons. One is that that's the point where we'll have a very good understanding of the year end from this current year. So we'll have the full knowledge of how everything's been calculated and where we've got to. We'll also have a very good sense of how the year has started out in terms of, you know, what are we seeing in terms of income, demand pressures and so on. And we'll have a better indication of where the government's heading policy-wise. And so if this summer we're still looking at, you know, this a very large gap, we will be coming forward with, you know, detailed proposals to how to fill that. And I think you should, I encourage, you know, you to continue to challenge us on this point, because it's obviously, you know, fundamental for the future of the council.
So can I just say I'm very glad you've said that you think it's a good challenge, because I think I can understand why it's been said that this is a political question, but in reality it, you know, it can be interpreted as political, but it's not just political, because, and it's not, you know, I'm not even asking it from political motivation, because as we know, one of the aspects of the behind the Croydon situation was a criticism of the scrutiny process, and there wasn't sufficient challenge. And we are sitting here in our papers with this obviously, yes, I appreciate the transparency, but with this admission in there that we are, you know, we could be heading for this situation. And of course we have to ask about this, and of course we have to seek answers. And I do appreciate that you think it's a good challenge, and I do look forward to hearing what is going to be done about this, genuinely.
Great. Okay, I'm going to bring in Jeff.
Yes. One of the things I'm worried about is capacity, really. So in two parts, really. The first part being, do you think the council's got sufficient capacity to bring forward proposals in good time to carry out the required consultation with everyone? And can I ask what discussions the council have had and is planning to have with the unions and other partners to deal with the budget gap in the coming years, in 22-23 in particular, obviously, because I think it does quite a lot of harm, really, if people feel this is suddenly brought upon them. So I think sort of the consultations really have to sort of be in place as early as possible.
Right, I'll start with Adam and then bring Dawn in.
Just briefly, and Dawn will want to say more on capacity. I mean, I think you're right that we do need to make sure that we're starting any process, you know, early. That gives us the time to pull forward, you know, proper proposals and so on. And some of this is a rolling process. You know, efforts to manage demand in adults and children's social care is an ongoing effort, and there have been many evolutions of that effort. To the point of the unions, I mean, I've always engaged with the unions formally and informally on the budget process. We've got our employee consultative forum meeting, which will cover the budget coming up. And I think you're absolutely right that if there was coming to a point where major changes were going to be required, we've got to make sure the unions are fully engaged in that as well.
Okay, Jeff. Sorry, Dawn. Yes.
I just wanted me to comment on capacity. I think capacity is very, very stretched across the organisation. Both I think Adam and Sean have referenced to that tonight. As we are now starting to plan about how we are going to tackle our financial challenges going forward, it's a very good point, because what capacity we are likely going to have to get extra capacity in, and we have to make sure that it's very targeted to what we need to do to meet our budget challenges.
Okay, Jeff, was there any follow up to that?
So, not really, but I do think that the sort of capacity is going to be very, very tight, obviously, as we all recognise, and it cause further problems if there's a theme that our consultations, whether it's with the union or sort of the wider public, are seen, to come in very late or not to be comprehensive, because this is really a massive sort of problems and thing we're talking about. So it is important to focus on it, I think, when there's so much going on.
Lots of nodding from Adam, so I think he takes your point. Canty.
All right, thank you, Chair. I just wanted sort of some help with understanding, because I think they affect all the budgets 2021, 2022, 2024. There's 2 or 3 items generally, if you can help with Dawn probably. So I think this is in relation to some technical adjustment issues. So firstly, so my understanding is the new homes bonus in future years, you said we're reversing 728k of reductions. So my understanding is we're putting it back, so we will get those back. Okay, so that was one. Then the other item was another approved 100 million for investment income program. I just wanted to know how much we actually borrowed, and I understand the reasons why it's being stopped and so on and so. And it makes a small contribution, but if you can understand how much has actually been borrowed. And my final question is around the Public Works Loans Board in terms of the change of policy, and well, the projected reduction in rates. Is Harrow in line to benefit from the change in the or reduction in the interest rates? Are we going to benefit hugely?
Okay. Do you want me to? Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the new homes bonus, now previously, we were told that the new homes bonus would phase out. So our previous budget in Mtfs assumed that the new homes bonus would phase out. We've now been told that that grant will continue in. So where our previous MTF assumed it would phase out, we're now just building that grant back in. So we're making the assumption that what we get in new homes bonus now will continue in some format over the period of the MTFS. In terms of the 100 million investment income, so yeah, we did have that as part of our investment strategy. We have decided to remove that from the budget because there's challenges, general financial challenges, but challenges about securing investments, proper investments that meet the criteria. We didn't borrow that £100 million, so we haven't borrowed that money to do that programme with, and then we have in effect the money sat in the bank that we would have to pay back. So we didn't borrow. Out of the 100 million, we purchased one property. I can never remember the name of the property. It's one in Wales, which was £6 million, but the rest of the money we didn't borrow. In terms of the PWLB, the rates did go up. They've now come back down. We have, as a council, we haven't done any borrowing for over a year now. We've tried to, during these challenges, this year's been very difficult. We've tried to manage everything within cash flow. So to save on capital financing charges, but just to try and make things a little bit easy, not do one thing. What we will do is when we've got our forecasts when we start to take on borrowings, if we have to do in the future, obviously we will make the best use of the lower rates that we can do.
Canty, do you have any follow-up to that?
That's all for now. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. In terms of this area, are there any other questions? Dan?
Yeah, it's just in relation to the budget gap that Councillor Greek raised. I think, Adam, you made a case as to how it's a structural problem with local government funding rather than Harrow Council problem specifically. Do you have any context from your work talking with your colleagues in other boroughs about where that size budget gap in relation to our reserves sits with similar boroughs across London? And I read my local government association newsletter today, which I'm sure everybody else did. And it's calling for a fair funding review, kind of urgent action from the government for a 3-year settlement. It's a shame the leader hasn't been able to make it here, but what work are we doing as part of London Councils and the LGA to try and kind of push that forward as a priority?
Adam.
Thanks, Dan. And I think Dawn, is also in touch with treasurers around London, and will have, a lot of detail on the different reserve position. I mean, in general, we still, with £10 million reserve, find ourselves at the low end across London, even though many councils are using reserves at a much faster rate than we are. We've largely been building up reserves a little bit over time. I think the difference for us is because of our low reserve position, we've always been really, really cautious about spending and about the savings proposals we put in. And as you'll have seen, that we don't have a huge number of savings proposals in the budget, whereas some councils are now in a position where they're putting very, very large figures, which aren't necessarily always backed up with very, very clear proposals. So, sometimes they've been in a position where they put figures in, they're not achieving them, and then all of a sudden they're calling on, potentially millions of pounds of reserves in a single year. So I think that puts us, that's where our position has been, fairly strong compared to others, not so much in our actual reserves, but more in terms of our ability to not have, huge, not rely on very, very large savings. In terms of the fair funding review, clearly there has been a bit of a delay around that. I mean, we've had better engagement. I think Sean would also offer this with the government, local government finance team. One of whose members, it turns out, lives in Harrow, which is very exciting. Then actually, I think in any previous year that I've been portfolio holder, and we've made our case very strongly around Harrow. Obviously, London councils as well is very, very concerned about the impact of any fair funding review on London as a whole. And I think while obviously we do hugely need a multi-year funding settlement, fully support that, we equally need one that doesn't, end up putting London in an awful position when, London's economy has obviously been as badly, if not, more actually worse hit than many others, and where London still has some of the highest poverty rates in the country. Dawn, do you want to come in on that?
I don't really think I've got anything to add to level that Adam has explained our position, and I can't really add anything to that. In terms of fair funding, it's we are very, very engaged. We've had regular meetings with MHCLG to explain our position. We've been very transparent with them what it means for us. We engage very heavily with London councils in terms of work that comes out in terms of fair funding, so we can make sure we always put our comments across. What does it mean for us? I think one of the challenges of fair funding is and sort of Adam has kind of already alluded to this, is it's the fair funding review is kind of slices up the cake, and I think what we've got to be very clear about is that we need more money to go into the pot, so that when they divvy up the cake, we get a bigger piece of that cake. If there's not extra money put into the pot, because the spending review sets a quantum of money for local government, the fair funding review divvies it up based on need. So we need to make sure that we engage in all the conversations that those factors that measure need reflect Harrow as best we can, to make sure we get our voice heard. But also we do need to make sure that the two go together, so we get more money put into the pot, because one of the challenges is if more money isn't put into the pot, it's just slicing up the cake a different way, and that's quite challenging.
Okay, great. Anything else in terms of budget gaps and future plans for anyone on this item? I can't see any hands up. I can't see anyone indicating. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to try and bring the next two areas together. So any questions around the capital programme, regeneration, and debt? Stephen.
Thank you very much. It's quite notable, looking at page 61 of the papers in the capital programme, which is table 1, looking at the size of our capital financing costs, and just how much we're spending on servicing our capital debt. You know, this year it's 38.7 million, which is 22% of our budget. Sorry, 2021-22 is 38.7 million, 22% of our budget. 2022-23 is 43.6 million, which is 25% of our budget, which is quite significant, especially in the context of what we've just been saying about the budget gap. What are we doing to try and bring down our level of debt so that we're not spending so much money financing it?
Okay, Dawn.
Do you want me to? I mean, I think it's fair to say that we are very acutely aware of Harrold's level of debt. We currently have a level of debt of 422 million pounds. Just to give the committee some assurance, we manage that very closely. So I've already explained, for example, that we haven't borrowed any additional money during the COVID, so that we can keep those capital financing costs down. I think that when I don't want to get too technical here, because I think the capital financing costs are there's sort of two key elements of the capital financing costs. There's the interest cost, which is around about, and I haven't got that page in front of me, Cam, so you'll have to excuse me. There's the interest cost that's around about £7 or £8 million. Then there's what we call as a minimum revenue provision, which is kind of like a set aside, which is in effect what we use to fund our debt. So I don't want to get too technical, but I think over the last few years we have done rigorous resets of our capital programme. And you know, Adam has been we've worked very closely with Adam in terms of only putting things into our capital programme that, for example, met very strict health and safety needs, were in there on an investor save, or the cost of the capital finance could be covered by income generation, to try and very much restrict the growth of the capital programme. We monitor our debt all the time with a view to how can we get that debt down. One of, you know, we've already explained we've moved significant chunks from our capital programme in terms of investment, etc., because we were concerned about could we generate the returns to warrant that increase in the capital programme. So it is something that we are acutely aware of. But once again, some of it is quite a challenge, because, for example, we do have to fund things. We don't get any extra funding for our capital. We do have to invest in roads. We do have to invest in street lighting. We have to invest to keep our buildings health and safety compliant, which does require some capital investment. So it really is, it's very much a balance to make sure we do what we have to do, but we always try and maintain that we keep our debt to a minimum by managing our cash flow very well, managing our capital receipts, etc., to try and really minimise that.
Okay, Kanti.
Hi, thank you, Chair. Could we have some kind of indication in terms of our £420 million debt? What is the projection in terms of when can we realistically actually pay this debt? Say, for argument's sake, we didn't borrow any more money going forward. How long will it take us to pay that debt off?
I mean, it's a bit, I'm trying to think. Well, in order to pay the debt off, what we would do is we would have to, I mean, I think first of all, just so people understand, it's very common for authorities to have a level of debt. We are not different in terms of having an element of debt. And I think, what we've also got to bear in mind is some of that debt, for example, has been recently our biggest level of debt was taken on when we bought the housing stock, when there was the changes around the HRA and such. So in very simple terms, if we were to pay that debt off, we would have to say, okay, so over how many years do we want to pay that off? And we would have to make a contribution to paying that debt off over a period of time, wouldn't we? Would say 50 years or whatever. I think the reality is that's very difficult for us to do. I think the reality is managing. I think one of the challenges of local government is managing your level of debt in terms of affordability, and as I say, making very good use. For example, making good use of the tools that we get in. For example, if we have capital receipts, we can use that to pay down our debt. So that's kind of the tools that we use. So unless we set a very in simple terms, unless we set a very specific strategy, we're going to pay X amount down over so many years, the reality is as an authority, we are going to have a level of debt, and our challenge is to manage that, to make sure that we minimize, we minimize, or we have an achievable level of debt that can be contained within the revenue account.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, sorry. Yeah, so obviously I think everyone's quite concerned about the level of the financing costs, and I mean, whether we call it interest or interest in capital and how we're going to spread it. Now, the fact you're putting this to the budget, I mean, it does concern us that it's going up without us borrowing. So, I mean, just trying to understand it, because our understanding is about 18 months to 2 years ago, I think we embarked on a refinancing strategy whereby we did spend a lot of money as a one-off, because the benefit long-term was great in terms of lower interest rates. Now, having understood that at that time, it does concern me why 25% of our budgets actually be going to be servicing debt rather than providing services to residents.
I think we need to. I'm trying not to go too technical, but I think we need to understand the amount of money that is spent on servicing the debt is the capital financing, which is about £7 or £8 million, and that is the line that impacts on the revenue account. So we do have to include a line in our revenue account to pay the interest charges. The minimum revenue provision, and you're quite right, Councillor. We have to keep an eye on that when we do get any opportunities to refinance our loans, and we can therefore repay a loan at maybe like 4% and refinance that capital at 2%. We would do that because we therefore make a saving on that level of capital financing. The minimum revenue provision is it's a bit of an oddity to local government finance, and what we have to do is every year we have to say how much of our budget would we have to set aside to repay our loan, pay our loans, or there's some but what we do. So for example, if we say we have to set aside £25 million, we use that money to fund our debt. So we don't hold the money in a bank account, but we use that set aside to fund our borrowing for things like roads and lights, so we don't end up taking on additional capital financing to fund that expenditure. And that's how we manage to continue with our investment, but not having to take on additional external debt.
Sorry, Chair, I know you want to jump off. So is that a notional provision? You're actually paying any money out when you make the MRP provision? It's a provision.
It's a notional set aside, and what it's intended to do is, if we only reflected the capital financing costs in our budget, all we would be reflecting is the cost of the debt. What we have to do is we have to make a notional reflection that this is the repayment of our debt based on the life of the assets that we've got. But what we're not doing is we're not having to take a chunk of our revenue account. We do have to take a chunk of that money and repay financing costs to the bank or Public Works Loans Board. We don't have to take that chunk of MRP out of our budget and put it in a bank account to set aside for, to set it aside.
I think I've always
in the budget then. Why is MRP then part of the budget? I can understand that in reality, for bookkeeping or booking entries in financial statement, you need it. But then the understanding is, because it causes this massive imbalance of reality and what's not reality. Because when you do an MRP provision, which in essence is notional, you're not taking money out of the system, it does become quite an oddity, as I described, to say, why does it belong in the budget then? Because it's not money flowing out of the council.
I think I don't want to get too technical. It's a technical adjustment that we have to do in terms of local authority accounting.
Right.
And it is a set aside that we have to do, but it's not a set aside. We can reuse. I'm going to sound really complicated. We can kind of reuse the set aside, and that's what we do. We use that to finance our capital expenditure rather than taking on additional borrowing.
I mean, I have explained to other people MRP as very similar to depreciation. Yeah. I mean, it's there. You'd see in our final accounts there is no line of depreciation that you would get in the private sector, but it is charged to the profit and loss account in the private sector because you have to reflect that somewhere. Because you don't have depreciation in local government, you have MRP, which is an equivalent. Is that fair to say, Dawn?
Yeah, and I think that is a good way of describing it, Sachin. And I think that the reason why it's like a notional interest is it can't be a cost that we take account of when we set our council tax. So when we set our council tax, we set, or what we call as our tax requirement, and we have to say all the costs that we're going to incur as a local authority, we would have to account for the interest charge. But like in private sector, depreciation is notional interest. It comes in and it comes out again. The MRP charge comes in to show it in the statement of accounts, but then goes back out. It gets reversed back out again when we set our tax requirements.
Right. I'm gonna take the silence as consent. Are there any other questions? Capital program, debt regen.
Sorry, do you mind I just ask? Oh, sorry, I think Councillor Greek has a question. Sorry, I can come in at the end on the section just for a brief.
Okay. Yeah, Stephen.
Thank you. I wanted to ask some questions about regen. Firstly, I just wanted to check the position on. Obviously, when we had the original regen programme, we made a certain amount of expenditure. I think it was something like 30 million, somewhere in that region. How much of that cost, given that we're now moving into a whole new regen vehicle and new schemes and that sort of thing, how much of that original cost is now abortive and has to be written off? And what then happens to it? Does it then, will it then find its way into our revenue budget, or what's going to happen to that expenditure?
Do you want me to start on that, Adam? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, we are on the regeneration. We have had some abortive revenue costs over the last few years. So, for example, we had an abortive revenue cost on Vaughan Road when that site was sold, where we had spent some money on design fees, etc., that were no longer going ahead. In terms of the residual spend on some of the 3 sites that's in the current regeneration programme, we are working through some of that expenditure that was spent on the old scheme that we can't. I'm trying to think of the exact technical wording that we can't say is still relevant to the new scheme. Now, some of it is because it's supporting the new schemes like planning and some of that work that we did. But I think we have been very honest in saying with all briefings that there is an element of that expenditure that will no longer be viable because things are changing and we will have to write off to the revenue account. Now, what we are doing is we are working through that to make sure whatever level of write-off it is, and obviously it's absolutely correct. When we do have to do that, what in effect happens is money where it's previously been charged to capital, and now what we're saying is that we now no longer we won't have an asset against which to offset that expenditure. It is literally a transfer over to the revenue account. So we will have to show that against the revenue account and obviously pick that up as part of our revenue account.
Thank you. Do we have any idea how much that will be? Because obviously we're in a situation where we're talking about budget gaps and that sort of thing. If that's going to be quite an extra hit on our revenue account, then do we do we have some idea, or if not, at what point will we have some idea?
I can't commit to a figure at the minute, just because I'm being very honest. We are working through that because we've got to the preferred bidder stage now, so we have a clearer idea of what's going to happen going forward under the new arrangements. This is why we're working through this now. It will be all wrapped up as part of our return. So when we do our out-of-term report in June, it will be wrapped up as part of that process.
Thank you. And for if there are any costs that are not abortive and that that are still good, will there be a mechanism for getting, for kind of sharing those costs into the vehicle, so that obviously if we've spent those costs but now the vehicle is getting the benefit of that, will we get will there be some cost sharing and money coming back to the council as a result of that?
It's very unlikely that there will be cost sharing of costs already incurred. But obviously going forward it's 50-50, but it's very unlikely that some of the costs that we've previously incurred at the moment, we're not having the conversation about those being transferred in.
Okay, thank you for that. And also just a sort of a general question on sort of going forward. Obviously, as we know from Croydon, one of the major issues that they had that caused their problem was the management of their brick by brick regeneration scheme. What are we doing to avoid that sort of problem happening in Harrow with our with our future plans?
I think that's very, very different than what we're doing at Harrow. Brick by Brick was a separate company that they set up, so it's like a separate trading entity. And part of Croydon's challenge, wasn't it, is that the council lent that company, I think it was £245 million worth of money. And part of the issue with Croydon was that obviously that money had to be paid back, and the company never paid it back to the council. So they never paid the interest or the principal. Now we haven't done that at Harrow, and just to give this committee some assurance, the only loan that we made that we did have we have a very small trading company structure. We had a loan to our LLP that holds the properties in Gayton Road, and I think that loan was just over £1 million that had to be paid back within 6 months, and that was all paid back, and that was paid back a couple of years ago. So we have no loans to any form of trading company structure.
Okay, thank you for that. And also on a separate issue, I noted I think it was in the capital budget that we're still expecting an income of something like 650,000, I think, from the depot redevelopment. Now, as we're planning to, as we it doesn't seem like we're going to use that, for a commercial use. I thought we'd given up on using that as a commercial use in terms of the regeneration program, and we're going to be using that entirely for civic offices. So why have we kept that income in the budget?
We've got, in terms of the depot, when we set our budget, our draft budget for next year assumes removing income from our original sort of depot target. We are removing £631 million worth of income from the budget, on account of that we've achieved some income on the depot, by renting out the space, etc. So that's removed. So the amount of money that is left in the budget that relates to the depot it's roughly around £500,000, and that is remaining in the budget. So that's the money that we're generating in from renting out the repair shop, the other activities that are going on at the depot. So,
because what I thought I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that we said we weren't going to get that money this year, but we'd kept that, we'd kind of rolled that saving over for a future year. Is that correct?
Well, because on the depot we had, and I'm going to quote general, I'm going to quote some specific numbers on the depot from memory, we had about £2 million over a period of time that was income built into our budget through income generation activities at the depot, from both the original depot and the extension of the 2 floors. You know, we've achieved some of that income, but some of our aspiration wasn't doable, and we have removed a level of that income from the budget. So it's no longer there, and so we've just got a residual value still in our budget that is being achieved.
Right. So are we are we still expecting a level of income then from the depot, even taking into account that it's going to be basically, you know, it's basically going to be the kind of, you know, it's basically going to be our civic centre apart from the civic functions. It's going to be used for civic offices.
But there is still some activity that will, irrelevant of what will happen with the depot in future years, there is still some activity going on at the depot around the workshops. Some of that space is being used by, you know, some of the units are being rented out, some of the space is used by others, and that does generate an income. And because, you know, part of the depot will always be an operational site, we will continue to receive a level of income.
Okay. Right, thank you very much.
I can see Candy put you in now.
Okay, just to follow up on that, something that Stephen said, I've got my own question as well. Yeah, because I think our understanding was because the council didn't obtain permission or planning permission in terms of, you know, providing any kind of commercial use, so we can't really get this income. That was our understanding. Firstly, do you want to deal with that first, and I'll come to my question?
I think that relates to the 2-storey extension at the depot. So we had an original scheme to build a new depot, and then there's an extension, and as has been reported, there were some planning permission issues with that extension in terms of letting the property out for commercial purposes.
Yeah, I'll come to my questions now. I've got 2 areas I would like to cover. I mean, firstly,
if you can be quick, please, Candy, that'd be great.
I'm always quick, Sachin, don't worry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, firstly, in terms of the regeneration, so I think we know quite a lot, but can you confirm that sort of, you know, the depot sort of going ahead is not going to cause any further issues in terms of our already stretched budgets? What kind of contingencies are planned for you know, anything going wrong with that? And my second question is regarding, yes, the council kind of tax is going up again. As Adam's also here, what reassurance can you give residents to say their core services like bin collection, cutting the grass, trimming trees, and, you know, keeping the parks tidy and neat will not be affected at all going forward? What reassurance can we give them despite all the pressures that we kind of experience as a council right now?
Okay, let's start with Dawn on the technical, and then we'll go down.
So in terms of the depot project, we have been through a very robust costing exercise for the depot in terms of what was the original money put into the budget and what additional funding was needed to be put into the budget. And I think
Sorry, Dawn, I meant the regeneration project as well, not just the depot. Sorry.
Okay. So sorry, Canty. So
it's just saying that reassurance you can give us about the that, you know, the regeneration project per se will not cause any issues or pressures on already stretched budgets. What contingencies, you know, are being planned or thought of to make sure that it doesn't happen or ever impinge on the council's budgeting process?
Okay. I mean, to say no pressures are ever going to arise, I mean, you know, I can't commit to that because, you know, things will always happen. I think the way that the new, and, you know, Adam might want to come in on this, but I think the way the new regeneration scheme is being set up is very, very different than what we've done in the past. So in the past, it was all about the council would deliver the sites, and it was, you know, a lot of sites being done all at once. What we've got now under the new regeneration programme is we've got the development partnership that We've got the preferred bidder of Waits, and obviously we're working through signing the contract with them. You know, it was about getting their technical expertise on board. It's a 50-50 arrangement. So I think the whole approach to the regeneration scheme this time is very different. It's using other people for their skill and having a risk share arrangement. And I think it's also very important to note that when we did go out for the original contracts, or our procurement basis, we went out on a cost neutral basis for some elements of that regen programme. So it's about making sure what the aspiration for the council could be achieved on a cost neutral basis for the organisation. So I think it's just very different than what the approach that was previously taken.
Okay, and Adam, on the point about bins and so other services.
Yeah, and I just reassure Councillor that, you know, because of the difficult decisions that are taken around council tax, you know, that our focus is making sure that we can continue to deliver those core services, and we'll focus on doing that. And my understanding is that, you know, complaints are very low, and that service provision is very good. I've had very few complaints about any of those core services this year. I know parks over the summer were incredibly busy, and not everyone was very respectful of them, and we had some challenges then. But obviously, we'll continue to make sure that we, you know, deliver those services to the highest possible standard.
Okay.
Just in that, Adam, in terms of, you know, the helplines the residents call, isn't that a decision that's, well, doesn't give us a huge saving, but inconvenience a lot of people and actually probably discriminates against people who are not IT savvy or have access to the internet or computers? What are we doing to make sure that no one falls through the net? I think it's a serious concern, and one that we need sort of, you know, some kind of overall strategy to say that, you know, we can reassure the people that really need this, because we are getting a lot of personal phone calls to help them with little minor things because they can't go online.
And I really want to hear more, you know, about that experience that you have. And if you do get those queries, please do just, you know, share them with me as well, because I personally, and to councillors that have got in touch with me, had really actually surprisingly few comments about the fact that some of those phone lines have been taken offline now. And we continue to put our energy and investment into two things, really. One is making sure that we're as easy as possible to transact with online, that all the questions can be answered. And we've got a really user-friendly website, and obviously we had a new website launched last year. And the second thing is to make sure that we have targeted support to those people who really can't get online, so support through the library, support through the one-stop shop, support through the advice services that we offer, and our digital inclusion strategy. And so that's where we really want to put our energy. Now, the one exception to that is in particularly our revenue and benefits lines, where obviously there's some really, you know, difficult and sensitive issues and very complex cases that we're still dealing with. You know, we're continuing to invest to make sure that anyone who is able to transact online can do that, even in those really complex cases. But while we still have, you know, vulnerable people who are relying on us for key bits of income, you know, we will keep those phone lines. We'll make those phone lines available.
Okay, thank you, Adam. I don't see any other indication. So I want us to go on for probably no more than 5 or 6 more minutes. So I'll just open it up now to any general point or something that didn't quite fit into the areas that people want to make. Provide people with short questions and short answers. Jeff. You're on mute, Jeff.
Apologies. I'm not sure we've touched on it yet, really. But I'm concerned really about sort of the new rates of council tax, the issue of low pay, which we know about it in Harrow, and the fact that unemployment is rising, which leads me to a concern really about the use of bailiffs. I think the council's made great progress on the use of bailiffs over the last few years, which I'm pleased. But it's it's likely, I feel, that it's going to be more difficult to collect council tax in the this year, and I'm really concerned about seeing the use of the bailiffs increasing. So can I really ask what, if any, thought has gone into sort of the issue of collecting council tax in what is going to be an increasingly difficult environment?
Thanks very much for the question, Jeff. Really important question. So we did take a decision last April where some councils said, look, don't worry about paying your council tax. We said, look, if you can pay, please do continue to pay, because it is so essential. Otherwise, we'll get ourselves into huge trouble, later in the year. And I think that didn't. And of course, we also said to people, if you have trouble paying, get in touch immediately. And we had policies in place to try and make sure we had, as generous as possible repayment plans that we could put in place. But because of that strategy, actually our council tax collection rate hasn't been as bad as it might have been and as we anticipated it could have been. Having said that, and in addition, I should say that with some support from government, people who have moved on to council tax support this year because they've lost their job, for example, have had a £150 a discount to the council tax they pay, which means many of them they don't pay really anything or haven't paid anything this year. So that's been positive. I think as we look ahead, it is hugely challenging, and I think there's two sides to it. One is that we, from our side, need to do everything we can to support council tax support recipients, and we're looking at policies and around that, and what we can do to support those recipients. And we'll come back very soon with more on that. And part of that could be direct support, but part of that could also be building up our fund that we use, what I call our council tax protection fund, which is the fund that we use to effectively avoid having to send bailiffs, because it gives us more flexibility to write off council tax debts. So that's one strategy. So that's really the sort of local efforts that we can put in place. I do think the other thing is that it has been really good that the government has put in place additional £20 a week on universal credit. It's been a lifeline for millions of people. We just have to make sure that that isn't taken away at the end of March, because I think that would wipe out almost anything that we could do locally, because it's £1,000 off the lowest income households in the country, and would cause huge damage. So I think those are the two things: more investment that we can put in place locally, and we'll come back on that, and of course trying to make sure we do have the welfare safety net there as well.
Okay.
Right. Can I just sort of jump in? I'm pleased here. I think that's quite positive, but I think really and truly for sort of the people in that difficult position, what we do on sort of debt management and sort of steering people or signposting people to debt management where it's required?
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, the two things we'd always do with someone who was struggling to pay, we'd signpost them to the range of charities, so whether it's local citizen advice or national debt charities like Step Change, for example. But also from our perspective, what we're always looking to do with people who can't pay is find a payment plan that works. So looking at their income and expenditure, and then working out what's a reasonable amount they can pay each month. And I think that for anyone who's getting into that situation where they might be starting to miss council tax payments, we always say, look, give us a call, and also make a payment, make whatever payment you can, because once we're seeing people are putting some money towards their council tax, then we can get confidence that okay, they are people are serious about doing their best to pay their council tax within their means. It's people who say I'm not going to pay anything, that can sometimes rack up quite quickly into getting into court summonses and then eventually bailiffs and so on. So I'd always encourage people to get in touch and make whatever payment you can afford to make as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks.
Stephen and then Candy.
Thank you very much. A couple of quick questions. Firstly, just wanted to check the council tax figures in the budget in front of us. Do they include the set of precepts that we're expecting from the GLA, or is that on top of it? Secondly, would you say that in terms of the council tax collection and the ability to pay council tax collection, that furlough has played quite a significant role in the ability of people to be able to pay council tax where they otherwise may not have been able to.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So GLA precepts not included, so that's obviously additional, and that's just been recently announced. I believe actually GLA precepts is formally confirmed, I think possibly even after we set our final budget. Is that right? Yeah, nothing. So, but obviously we've got the proposal and to work on that basis. And then to the point about furlough, I mean, you know, Councillor Green, absolutely, I'm sure it's made a big difference. We always think, you know, there's a group of people who were previously on benefits before, you know, the pandemic struck, who probably have, you know, received a bit of extra support through £20 a week and some of the other sort of hardship grants that come through. And their incomes, you know, to some extent, remains quite stable. There's a group of people who, you know, kept their incomes either through furlough or through keeping their jobs, where, you know, their incomes have been okay. And then there's people who are sort of have suffered the biggest change in income, where they either lost their job or frankly, where, you know, the 80% furlough payment, if they're already on a low income, 80% takes them, you know, to a level that they can no longer sustain their spending. So those are the groups, the people who've had that experience, that change, who've been, you know, worst impacted.
Okay, and Candy.
Thank you, Chair. I think just bring something that I was, you know, I've got very sort of high concerns about in terms of, given the fact that we're in the, you know, every discussion we're having right now is around the pandemic, which means health is a major concern or should be the priority. So it's just my suggestion, as Adam's here from the administrative team or cabinet, that it does concern me that obviously that we're not pushing hard enough in terms of, you know, overall health strategy long term for every citizen of the borough in every respect. Yes, sometimes funding is necessary, but sometimes it's the mindset and, you know, encouraging everything, including our planning policy, our existing spaces, open spaces, parks, you know, our leisure centres and everything else possibly can think of, community groups, the NHS. I think I do not sense that urgency to say now is the time to get hold of this and, you know, have clear strategies, and that should be underlining every decision now, or, you know, pushing or driving every decision. So I hope you take this, and I've been trying to hint this to the leader as well from time to time. And I think it is time that it is given priority and we start seeing that as a major item in every policy, in every document. And I hope you can take that forward, Adam. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think I take the comments from you, Councillor Ruddigan.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Are there any other final comments from anyone? If you can't use your hand up function, if you want to unmute and say you want to ask a question. No, I can't see anything, so I'm gonna bring us to a close. So can I thank Dawn and Adam and Sean for coming today. I know that this is an incredibly busy time for you all with COVID and also all the budget stuff. So I know the committee really appreciates it. Can I echo Sean's point? Sean made the point, Stephen made the point as well, around the amount of work staff are doing generally over COVID. You know, when councillors are getting emails from council officers a few minutes to midnight on New Year's Eve, you know a lot of work is going on. It's just incredible, and I think we do need to have that on the record about that huge amount of work that is being done. And on behalf of the committee, thank you, officers, for doing that. And if Dawn, you can just pass that on through CSB, that point's been made. That's item 3. 3A, 3B and 3C are essentially all part of the same item. So the committee it does say that I need to summarise any outcomes, but we can just note those. The next, just want to make a note about next meeting. As has been discussed, we are talking about the accommodation strategy, which indeed some of the items that we discussed today may come up again, and for us to have enough time to do that before Cabinet discusses it. The next meeting has been moved to the 4th of February from the 9th of February. So if everyone could just amend your diaries, next meetings on the 4th of February. We also have an informal private session just for councillor members of the overview and scrutiny committee on the 25th of January. Again, that date should be in your diary, and that's a private session to allow officers to brief us on the accommodation strategy. I've got no other business, so at 8:55 I bring the meeting to a close. Thank you all, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you.